Middle Kingdom Egypt is in many ways very similar to Old Kingdom Egypt in terms of its art, in terms of its architecture. But in 3,000 years, things do change, and so we are going to see some changes between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom are separated by a period called an intermediate period, where basically the Old Kingdom started to crumble and Egypt almost fell into chaos. This had to do with sort of local governors gaining a lot of power and being able to threaten the power of sort of a series of weak pharaohs. And this led to pretty much civil war. This was stopped by a guy named Mentuhotep II, who reunified Egypt. We are looking at a picture of his successor, a guy named Senusret III. And this is where we can see one of the significant differences between Old Kingdom and New Kingdom sculpture. And if you look at the face here of Senusret, you will see that he is showing emotion, he is showing depth, he is showing worry. This is something we never see in images of the pharaoh in the Old Kingdom. And part of this is sort of reflecting Senusret's a difficulty with a people called the Nubian people, who he could never quite conquer, and sort of gave him a lot of consternation throughout his rule. But for the most part, you know, we retain many of those things, many of the sort of elements you should be familiar with from the Old Kingdom. We have that symmetry, we have that sort of lack of negative space, no gaps between the arms and legs, so we can preserve the integrity of the statue. We see very similar materials, you know, hard stone, diorite, those kinds of things still being used. Art remains restrained in its use of emotion. So Egyptian emotion is not going to, you're not going to be seeing like Jim Carrey level sort of expressions of emotion on Egyptian faces, even in the Middle Kingdom, where we do start to see a little more sort of emotional activity in the art. The big change, though, between Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom architecture is the pyramids go away. In terms of tomb architecture, we see a shift underground. One of the theories about the reason why this happened was the pyramids were just too easy to rob. There was a shift to underground tomb architecture, and that's what we're looking at here in this tomb of Khunumetep II. This is a rock-cut tomb. It is cut into the living rock. And you can even see in the background there is a column here that's broken. This column is purely ornamental because this was cut into solid rock, so the ceiling is more or less self-supporting. This is a man-made cave. And so we've moved very quickly through the Middle Kingdom into the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is where Egypt reaches its height of power. The New Kingdom came about after another intermediate period where a people called the Hyksos people conquered Egypt for a while. This New Kingdom was sort of a rebirth after a period of foreign occupation. So now we're going to take a look at one of the most powerful New Kingdom pharaohs, and this pharaoh is important not just because it was a very powerful pharaoh, but because she was unique. This is a female pharaoh. Pharaohs were the sons of Ra, and so female pharaohs are rare. Now there are a handful of female rulers throughout the history of ancient Egypt who served as regents. Oftentimes when a son was too young or a relative was sick, the queen would step in and serve as sort of a temporary ruler, or what's known as a regent. But this queen, a queen named Hatshepsut, became a full-blown pharaoh. In 1479, the pharaoh Thutmose II dies. His wife/sister, yes, there was inbreeding within the Egyptian families to preserve the royal bloodlines. His wife/sister, Queen Hatshepsut, had no male children. So this title went to her stepson, Thutmose III, from another wife, from a minor wife of Thutmose II. But Hatshepsut claimed that before he died, her grandfather, Thutmose I, had made her the pharaoh. She also claimed that Amun disguised himself, the god Amun, as her father and impregnated her mother, so she was part of a divine bloodline like all pharaohs were. Now, there was a lot of resistance to Hatshepsut being the pharaoh, but for the most part, this is a woman who ruled for pretty much 2 decades, who wielded a lot of power, as we will see in just a moment. With her temple, she was treated with great veneration and carried quite a bit of authority. Under her rule, she helped expand the Egyptian kingdom in the New Kingdom until her death, where she died probably of diabetes. What we're looking at here is an image of her with 2 jars of offering to the god Amun. She is shown here in a typical pharaoh's clothing. She is wearing the headdress of a pharaoh. She is wearing the beard of Osiris. So even though she is a woman, you see that she is shown wearing this artificial beard, which all pharaohs wore in sort of ceremonial purposes as a symbol of their power. You will also see that she is shown anatomically as male. She does not have breast here. Now, in some images, you will see her as anatomically female, but it is not uncommon to see her shown as male. And we have a lot of statues of her. We have something like 200 statues of her that have been reconstructed. This is her temple. This is a mortuary temple. So, in the New Kingdom, as in the Middle Kingdom, pharaohs and everybody else were buried underground. The pyramids went away. And so these tombs, these new tombs, were hidden. The mortuary temples, which had always been in use, there's mortuary temples that were associated with the pyramids. These mortuary temples become much bigger and much grander during the New Kingdom. And so what we're looking at here is Hatshepsut's massive mortuary temple. This was actually part of a much larger complex with several temples dedicated to various gods, all interconnected. Plus, during this time, there would have been vegetation, there would have been irrigation to give this this temple this sort of feeling of a paradise, of if you can imagine this sort of oasis sort of growing out of the desert, which was meant to reflect Hatshepsut's ability to provide for her people and to sort of reflect her divine power. So this incredibly large multi-level temple had smaller shrines to gods Amen, Hathor, Anubis, and like I said, it was connected to a much larger temple superstructure. In all, there's something like 200 statues of Hatshepsut throughout this temple. Here's some of the images of Hatshepsut I was talking about earlier. We can see her here as anatomically female. We can see her as male. We can see her here as a sphinx. There was a row of sphinxes in front of this temple, all depicting her as this sort of godlike creature. All, once again, sort of reflections of her power. In fact, this whole temple is a reflection of her power and her wealth. Many of her statues were destroyed. We don't know if it was due to people dissatisfied with her rule or the fact that she was a female pharaoh. There's no real documentation, but all of these have been reconstructed from thousands of fragments that were put together by conservators and restorers. The most powerful of the New Kingdom pharaohs is a guy named Ramses II. He ruled for a very, very long time and is the main reason why Egypt reached its sort of height of power and size. This is a temple from Abu Simbel. This is his mortuary temple, so very similar to Hatshepsut's mortuary temple in that it's cut into sort of the living rock. You can see that Ramses is trying to show his power. There are 4 massive statues, all portraits of Ramses. The smaller statues depict his family members. He is shown here in sort of a kind of typical pharaonic seated posture here. Inside, we see more images of Ramses II. In 1968, this temple was moved. There was a reservoir constructed, and the entire temple was moved something like 600 feet away up the side of this mountain because it was going to be flooded with this reservoir. So that in itself is extremely impressive. Another kind of temple that we see in the New Kingdom are called pylon temples. Pylon temples are these massive complex of temples. The temple that we're seeing here to Amun-Re at Karnak was constructed by several different pharaohs, each trying to sort of one-up each other, each trying to add sections that were more impressive than the last. They're called pylon temples because of the 2 pylon-shaped walls flanking the central entrance. These temples were massive. They were built using what is called a hypostyle structure. Hypostyle we've already seen before in Persepolis. It is a temple or a building constructed out of many columns. One of the great inventions of this period in these pylon temples is the use of a clerestory window. Clerestory windows allow in more light. And that what you're seeing here is this sort of stair-step construction where a central part of the building is raised slightly higher than the outer part of the building. This allows for light to come in and illuminate the interior because, you know, this is before electric light, of course, and torchlight can only illuminate so far. So these clerestory windows were a sort of huge and an important invention. Let's look at some New Kingdom painting. This is an image of a guy named Nebaman and his family. Nebaman was a scribe. He was a counter of grain. So this is an Egyptian official. This is a guy with some power. This is a guy with some prestige. This is from his tomb. If we look at the central figure of Nebaman, we can see this use of hieratic scale. He towers over his wife. He towers over his child, his son, shown between his legs, grasping onto his father's legs. If you look at the body of Nebaman here, we can see that typical Egyptian composite figure, here better than ever, I think. We see the torso facing us. We see his head in profile with his eye seen from a frontal view as he strides, once again, sort of sideways. Also typical of the Egyptian composite view is the need to show the back of the hand on both hands. So this is an impossible, unless your hand is twisted completely around, this is an impossible view to show the back of the hand with the left thumb here and to see basically the same thing on this hand. But this is a composite view. Once again, this is not that perceptual but conceptual view of the body. And so for the ancient Egyptians and other ancient people, it's not important to show what a body really looks like, but how we think of a body. And so when we think of a hand or we think of a fist, we often want to think of it from the most visible angle, so from the back. But if you look around Nebaman and his family, with their lack of emotion, with their lack of interaction, with their sort of perfect eternalness and their composite view, if you look away from them and you look at this hunting scene, then we're seeing something, I think, rather cool. If you look at the animals, and especially the cat, I've zoomed in on this kitty cat, you can see that the artists are given a lot more freedom with the depiction of animals. And we've already seen this with our depiction of our statues of the scribes, right? And from the Old Kingdom. Sort of the more lower rank you were, the more naturalistic and expressive the imagery could be. And so with animals, we get this incredible naturalism and realism that we never see in images of human beings in ancient Egypt. Because the idea in Egypt is that human beings are, this is preparing you for the afterlife. This is preparing you for the next world. These were images of sanctimony. These were images that were meant to express a certain solemnity, because these are religious images relating to the sacred passage of from one realm of existence to another. And so the images of human beings are treated much more iconographically. They're more like symbols for people than they are actual descriptions of a person. But when we get to animals, we get these incredibly lifelike pictures. You can see that in the details of the birds here, and the way we see this rather complicated realistic view, sort of three-dimensional view of the wings overlapping. But especially in this cat, with its organic sort of line tracing its back, the arch of its back, with its mouth open as it grabs one bird wing in its mouth, as it grabs other birds with its claws. Its body seems to move and writhe in a very organic way. And when you compare that to the sort of the stiff geometric forms of the bodies of the human beings, the sort of cylinders for the arms, the triangles for the torso, you're looking at almost a completely different style. But this would have been painted by the same artist or the same group of artists. But they were given a lot more freedom to sort of experiment and create more lifelike imagery because they weren't dealing with human subjects. If we look at another mural from the same tomb, we can see that kind of realism and that kind of naturalism with human figures. What you're looking at is an image of 4 musicians. First of all, in the 2 left images, the 2 left women, we have that kind of strict Egyptian composite figure, their faces in profile. We see that eye on the side of their head. But the 2 figures on the right are sitting at this sort of more kind of 3/4 view. We're not getting a strict profile, but we're also not seeing a full frontal face either. What we're seeing instead is this sort of 3/4 profile, which is a lot more naturalistic, a lot more relaxed, a lot more realistic than any other depiction of the human form that we have seen thus far in ancient Egypt. If you look at the image on the right, you see an even more extreme example of sort of this relaxed, naturalistic depiction of the human form with these dancing girls. So we see these bodies kind of twisting and turning. We see this almost sort of rubber band elegant sort of line in the arms. This is what we call a curvilinear sort of quality to the arm. We see the hair sort of hanging down naturally from the head, and the bodies themselves, we see anatomical details that we normally don't see in Egyptian art, especially with the belly here. We see folds as the girls sort of lean over. We see the effect of gravity on the flesh of the belly of these young women as they dance. And that kind of detail is something we just don't normally see. We certainly don't see it at the Old Kingdom at all. But here in the New Kingdom, things are a little different. Now, you're not going to see this kind of realism when it relates to a person of power like a pharaoh or another high-ranking official, but among the lower classes, there's a lot more freedom given to the artist to depict things more naturalistically. I have spent a good portion of this lecture talking about the consistency of Egyptian art, and due to the Egyptian worldview, due to the Egyptian religion, and there is sort of a almost near obsession with, I won't necessarily say stasis, but certainly with a kind of unchangeability. this desire that things remain the same, because there's an inherent sort of conservatism in Egyptian religion that says that if there is too much change, then the world will fall apart, basically. Well, I lied just a little, just a tiny bit, because there is a period, about a two-decade period or so, during the New Kingdom, where a pharaoh, originally named Amenhotep IV, changes his name to Akhenaten. And this change isn't just a change in name. This is also a change in the Egyptian worldview. This is a change in the religious power structure, and a deep and significant change in Egyptian art. So Akhenaten renounces the old Egyptian religion and says that he and Nor Egypt will no longer worship the old Egyptian gods except for one, and this will be the god Aten, the sun god, not the god of the sun, which is Amun, but the sun itself, the disk of the sun. And he proclaims himself now the son of the sun. He is the son of and prophet of Aten. And he changes his name to Akhenaten, son of Aten, prophet of Aten. And he abandons the capital of Thebes, and he sets up a new city, which is now called Amarna, which is where we get this name, the Amarna Period. But for our purposes, the significant changes that he instituted are artistic. And we can see that immediately in this image of Akhenaten. Now you'll see that this is been broken. It's because the statues were destroyed after his rule. He was more or less erased from the historical record because he was considered to be his views were so apocryphal and antithetical to the Egyptian worldview. But we can see that immediately in this image of him, and if we compare it to this other statue of the pharaoh Menkaure from the Old Kingdom, there's a huge deviation between the norms. Akhenaten is shown with the sort of stereotypical wide shoulders that we associate with pharaohs. But if you look at his arms, at the musculature of his arms, you'll notice that they're almost spaghetti-like, sort of these thin, wispy kinds of columns. And then if you look at the shape of his torso and his body, he has these wide, almost sort of feminine kinds of hips. In fact, his entire features, if you look at his facial features, his features are elongated, his lips are pronounced. There is a very sort of streamlined, curvilinear quality to the way he is being depicted here. Now, there's arguments that this is because this is a realistic portrait of him. There are other statues of Akhenaten that don't look quite like this. Personally, and I think the majority of historians believe that this is a stylization, right? That this is meant to sort of deviate from the typical Egyptian style. And Akhenaten was sort of trying to demonstrate through visual strategies that we are in a new era, and our art of this era looks new. And there's this sort of elongated kind of aesthetic that dominates the Amarna period and separates it distinctly from all other Egyptian periods. And we can also see this aesthetic evident in this family portrait taken from a temple of Akhenaten. We have a family portrait. We have Akhenaten and his wife, the Queen Nefertiti, sitting facing each other. You'll notice the elongated forms in the sort of curvilinear form of his body, the lack of rigidity, the lack of stiffness, that sort of straight up and down that we're so used to seeing in Egyptian art. And portraiture is now, we see this kind of curve and sort of kind of slack to the spine in both Akhenaten and his wife. We also see an interaction with the family and with each other that is not normal in most Egyptian art. We don't often see real human contact, and when we do, it's very formalized. If we think of our sort of portrait statues of the couples, which are standing upright and barely touching each other. But we see real physical affection with the daughters here. And if we compare this to the image that we saw earlier, there's a huge difference between the Egyptian family portrait on the left and the one on the right in terms of how the lack of emotion in the one on the left, whereas the image on the right, we see eye contact between the king and the queen. We see smiles on their faces, and we see affection and love being portrayed towards their children. So we have an image here that breaks all of the rules. It has abandoned the traditional proportions. I mean, I can guarantee you he is not 18 hands tall here. It breaks the rigidity of Egyptian art. It breaks the emotional ban in Egyptian art and creates something completely and utterly new. Just like this monotheistic religion that Akhenaten subscribed to was uniquely and utterly new. You're looking at probably one of the most famous images from ancient Egypt, a portrait of Nefertiti by an artist named Thutmose. This was found in his workshop, unfinished. That's why she is missing the pupil in her left eye. So if you want to take a Sharpie and draw on your screen and fill in the pupil, please don't do that. But you can see that those sort of elongated features here are evident, especially in her neck. In fact, this whole form, which is known as a bust is a portrait of somebody from the chest up, is not evident in Egyptian art before this period. So as kind of another blow against tradition, Akhenaten has embraced this art form that was not common in Egyptian art. And Egyptians didn't normally embrace new art forms. That's their whole thing, man. So we have this sort of outlier of a kind of art form. We have the elongated features, but I think what's special about Nefertiti, not just compared to Egyptian art, but really art of most of the ancient world, is a sense of humanity, is a sense of life in her face. The artists have embraced a realism here that is not evident not only in other Egyptian art, but in really the rest of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world. And this is incredible. If you look at the muscles in her face, the artist has closely and obviously observed the way the human face works. So, you know, the fact that Egyptian artists often looked rather cartoonish and literally flat isn't because artists didn't have the ability to make realistic art, but it's because they didn't, because of the dictates of their religious beliefs. But when those dictates are gone and artists are allowed to embrace this kind of realism, boy oh boy, we see it sort of explode here in this incredible realism in her face. And what that realism does is not only give us a more naturalistic sort of image, but it also gives us a more relatable image, a more human image, because we see a smile, but not just a smile, a subtle smile, a regal smile, a smile of almost recognition, right? The corners of her mouth pulled slightly back as the folds of the skin form this small boundary around the corners of her mouth. And then you can see the sort of divot around that small muscle here as this pulls back into her cheek. The subtleties here are incredible. And we get the feeling, and we don't know for sure, but we get the feeling that if we could go back in time and see Nefertiti herself, that she would look like this. We are looking at maybe, and I'm just guessing here, but maybe the first real portrait of a human being that captures a likeness and a presence and and sort of an emotional core that we have never seen before. And we can see something very similar, although with a much more sort of stern kind of face in this image of Akhenaten's mother, a woman named Tie. And I can tell you this, that I would not want this woman as my mother-in-law, because she looks rather stern and severe, and she would probably not be amused by my jokes. But once again, we see the artist has captured an attitude, which something, Egyptians were the kings of the blank faces, right? They didn't really care about emotional expression, and yet we see once again, a sort of regal quality. We see a sternness, almost, I would say, a judgmental quality on this woman's face, but also an accuracy. We're looking at a realistic sort of tradition of portraiture that we are not normally exposed to in Egyptian art, or art of this period. And then Akhenaten dies, and he might have been executed. We're not exactly certain, but certainly a lot of people were not saddened by his death, especially the cult of priests, whose influence on Egypt was massive. And when he died, it didn't take long for the old religion to be reinstituted, to be restored, for the city of Amarna, or Akhenaten as it was called, to be more or less abandoned, and things sort of went back to the way they were. And we can see that in the art of the son of Akhenaten, the very famous pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. Now, this is a king that it's almost ironic. No, it is ironic. There's no almost here. It's ironic that he is arguably the most famous name from ancient Egypt. And the question is why? Because this is a guy who became king at a very young age. He was a small child when he was named king, and then he was he died at the age of 19 of disease. So this is a guy who, in his rule, did not much of anything, and yet his name resonates for thousands and thousands of years. And the reason is because when his tomb was discovered in 1923 by the English archaeologist Howard Carter, what Carter discovered was the most intact tomb in terms of its grave goods of any find in the history of Egyptian tombs. And so what makes King Tut famous is that he wasn't robbed. But what was found was absolutely incredible. There was over 5,000 individual items located inside of his tomb. And of course, the sort of piece de resistance is the mummy of King Tut himself and the layers of coffins that he was buried in. He was buried in a large stone sarcophagus, and then inside of that would have been another coffin with gold inlay and stones forming a portrait of the king. And then inside that would have been the mummy, and over the mummy would have been placed his death mask. It's also made with gold inlay and semi-precious stones and things like lapis lazuli and other sort of rare materials. Now remember, the pharaoh is a god, and so in the pharaoh's transportation to the afterlife, he undergoes a change from being a half god to a full god. And he is buried in gold, not just because gold is a luxury item and gold is associated with wealth and power, but also because gold is a divine substance. Gold is not prone to tarnish or rust. Gold is seen as eternal and perfect and divine, and that is why it is associated with divinity in religion after religion after religion. And this is no different. So you are not seeing just a mask of King Tut. You are seeing the face of a god. You are seeing a final sort of point of transformation of this sort of half mortal into full godhood. And if we look closer at his portrait, you can see sort of the traditional beard of the pharaoh, which sort of denotes wisdom and power. We see sort of the nemes, it's known, the nemes headcloth. And then we see the sort of double symbol of Upper and Lower Egypt, where we see the uraeus, or the cobra of Lower Egypt, and the vulture of Upper Egypt. On the back of Tutankhamun's death mask is a series of inscriptions in hieroglyphs that were meant to be symbols of protection, that were basically a kind of a spell from a holy book called the Egyptian Book of the Dead that was meant to guide Tutankhamun into the afterlife. There is sort of a hint of the Amarna period still lingering, and you can especially see that, I think, in the sort of full lips being portrayed here. But otherwise, we have a very sort of traditional kind of Egyptian image. If we look at this painted chest from King Tut's tomb, you can see also there's a looseness in the way the artist has depicted this image of conquest and battle, where we see King Tut in a chariot. Now, first of all, this is all fiction. King Tut was never in any battles. He never led any great armies. He was much too young and died too soon before any of that could ever happen. But he is a pharaoh, so we need to show him as a military conqueror. But notice on the left, we see a more or less kind of traditional Egyptian visual strategies here, with the use of 3 registers and a group of horses and chariots. But on the right, we see chaos in the form of the king's enemies. And this, of course, is meant to sort of symbolize or represent the orderliness, the divinity, the perfection of on the left of Egypt, with the chaos for the sort of uncivilized, uncouth that is their enemies. The Egyptians, of course, mummified their dead, and this was a major part of the process of preparing the body for the afterlife. What you're basically doing is dehydrating the body and removing all of the water out of the body by placing it in salts. And this is to preserve the body, to give the soul a sort of base to attach to so it won't get lost in the journey to the afterlife. But also certain organs were associated with certain aspects of the soul and certain gods. In fact, the god Horus, sort of the protector god of the pharaohs, had 4 sons, and there are 4 organs: the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, and the liver, that were explicitly associated with those 4 gods. These were extracted in a ceremonial way from the body. They were also preserved in salts and then preserved in these jars, which were then sealed with wax, and then with spells written on the side from the Book of the Dead to protect these. How do we know so much about Egyptian culture, Egyptian art, Egyptian history, Egyptian everything? Well, you can thank this rock. Or I should call it a stone, because this is known as the Rosetta Stone. When Napoleon's army had invaded Egypt in 1799, this thing was discovered, and it helped us understand these Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had not really been translated for thousands and thousands of years. And the reason it led is to this discovery of how to translate them is because there is a letter from a Greek ruler named Ptolemy V, translated into 3 different languages: traditional Greek, language called Demotic, and then Egyptian hieroglyphs. And once translators realized, specifically a man named Jean-Francois Champollion, realized, hey, this is the same thing, just written in 3 different languages. It gave us that clue. It gave us the Rosetta Stone, if you will, to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs. And now we could read things like this. This is that famous Book of the Dead I was talking about. The Book of the Dead was this collection of spells and incantations used by Egyptian priests to ensure the proper travels of the soul. It also gives us a lot of insight into what those travels and what those trials were thought to be. This is the judgment of a guy named Hugh Nefer. So Hugh Nefer is being led by the god Anubis, who is the god of death and embalming. And he is led to the goddess of truth, Mot. And Mot is weighing the soul in the form of the heart of this guy, Hunifer. And you notice that there's a scale here. Where's my little thing? And the heart is on one side and a feather is on the other. And if the heart is lighter than the feather, then that means that you are a good and moral character, you are just, and then that you get to pass on into the afterlife. Otherwise, if you don't, then you are eaten by this creature who's sort of part hippo and part lion and part crocodile named Amit, and it would really suck and probably hurt a lot. So you don't want that to happen. But if you are approved to continue, then good for you, and then you get to meet this guy Thoth, this god of knowledge, who writes down everything and says, all right, you check out, you're good, way to go, Hunifer. Let's go meet the big guy. And so then you are taken by Horus to meet Osiris, the god of the underworld. And Horus is the son of Osiris. And then standing behind Osiris, we see the goddesses Isis and Nephis, who are sisters. And Isis is the wife of Osiris. And so you're sort of greeted by this royal family. Notice the four little gods sitting on this lotus flower. These are the four sons of Horus. We can't get away from those guys. And we also have an image of the falcon and another image of Horus. And you are basically approved, or Hunifer is basically approved and welcomed by the king of the underworld. At the top, we see an image of Hunifer once again praying with and praising a series of Egyptian gods and goddesses who are all holding ankhs, which is the symbol of eternal life in ancient Egypt. And so this is just one small little part, one small little illustration of the Book of the Dead, but this is meant to illustrate that there is a judgment is part of this whole process. And then if we look at the very end of Egyptian art, you can see that this image is in many ways not different from what we have been looking at for literally the last 2,500 years, almost 3,000 years. We see this sort of stoic Egyptian face. We see this rather stiff and rigid sort of form. We see the left foot out, what I call the Egyptian hokey pokey. And in many ways, the art has changed very little, with the exception of the Amarna period, in 3,000 years. And that's 3,000 years of Egyptian art history in a very short amount of time. I will see you guys in the next video.